Apologies in advance for my nasally voice. I've had some pretty bad allergies over the last couple of days, and it just hasn't cleared up yet. Sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction, and today we're going to look at 3 stories that demonstrate that. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 3 or 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please ask the like button for a bite of their sandwich, and when they say yes, proceed to pack the biggest bite possible into your mouth. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's stories. People who live on Andover Street on Detroit, Michigan's east side will be the first to tell you that the area is known for constant drug activity. On Thursday, November 9th, 2017, 2 Detroit Special Operations police officers began an operation known as a push-off on Andover Street. A push-off is when undercover cops pretend to be drug dealers, and then when customers come up to them and try to buy drugs, they arrest them and seize their vehicles. These particular officers that would be doing this push-off had been undercover for some time in the area, and so they had a local drug house they used for these types of operations. At some point that day, 2 potential customers came up to the fake drug house. They knocked on the door, and the undercover police officers opened up. They invited them inside, and then once these customers were inside sitting down, they asked the undercover cops if they could buy some drugs. And as soon as the cops heard this, they whipped out their badges, they drew their guns, and they ordered them on the ground. But these potential customers, they didn't get on the ground. Instead, they whipped out their badges and drew their guns, and they said, "No, you get on the ground." Because it would turn out these customers were actually undercover police officers too, but they were from a different precinct, and so neither groups had any idea about the other. They had no clue that they were both undercover at the same time. Both sets of undercover cops were so surprised by what was happening that instead of firing shots at each other, they just stayed in this really tense standoff, like that famous scene from The Office where they're all pointing guns at each other and they're trying to figure out who the double agent is. And so the police are doing that, periodically hurling insults and threats at the other side in an attempt to get them to stand down. But when neither side stood down, they all just eventually lowered their guns and then proceeded to beat the living crap out of each other. After the dust finally settled and all the haymakers had stopped, the 2 groups of police realized their mistake and apologized to each other. Luckily, none of the officers were badly hurt from this mix-up. However, 2 officers did have to go to the hospital, but for very minor injuries. One had a black eye and the other had a split lip. While Detroit's own chief of police and the media and the public at large have all come out and said this snafu was a total embarrassment, others have said the officers involved might deserve a little bit of credit. Because after all, their job was to be undercover, and apparently they were so good at being undercover that they didn't even know the other group was undercover too, and vice versa. So perhaps they were just too good at their jobs. You be the judge. The following story was pulled from a 1997 article in the British Medical Journal. The article was written by the psychiatrist who treated the patient who will be the focal point of this story. The only reason I bring this up is because this story truly sounds made up. And it's not. One night in the winter of 1984, a healthy middle-aged woman, who we'll call Brenda for this story, was at her home in London reading a book when she suddenly heard a voice in her head. It said,
"Please don't be afraid. I know this must be shocking for you to hear me speaking to you like this, but this was the easiest way I could think of. My friend and I, we used to work at the Children's Hospital, and we would like to help you."
Brenda couldn't believe what was happening. She had never heard voices in her head before, and this voice that was speaking to her, it was so clear, and it did not sound like any voice she had heard before. And so at first, Brenda just sat on the couch and didn't do anything and just waited, hoping that maybe she was just imagining this. But the voice in her head seemed to pick up on her reaction and said,
Brenda, this is not a hallucination. We're real and we want to help you.
Brenda did not believe it was real. She believed she had just lost her mind. And so for the rest of the night, she just completely ignored the voice in her head. And first thing the next morning, she went to her doctor's office and said, please help me. The doctor referred her to a psychiatrist. And so she went over to the psychiatrist's office. And after they performed an evaluation of Brenda, they said, look, I don't really know why you're hearing these voices. There's no clear medical explanation for why. And so Brenda was ultimately diagnosed with something called functional hallucinatory psychosis, which basically means Brenda was hallucinating, but there was no clear reason why. The psychiatrist began treating Brenda with an antipsychotic drug as well as with supportive counseling. Over the next couple of weeks, as Brenda diligently took her medications and went to her appointments, the voices eventually stopped. And so Brenda went into her psychiatrist's office and she said, Doc, you've saved me. The voices are gone. I'm so happy. And the psychiatrist would later recall that Brenda was visibly relieved. It was obvious that she was not making this up, that she really believed that she had these voices and now they were gone. And so after Brenda left the office, she actually went on vacation with her family outside of London just to celebrate the fact that she had not, in fact, lost her mind. But while she was away on holiday, she started hearing the voices again. And this time they told her she had to get back to London as soon as possible because there was something terribly wrong with her. And they gave her a very specific street address that she was supposed to go to seek treatment. And so Brenda is horrified that the voices are back in the first place, but what she's really scared about is that maybe there's some truth to what these voices are telling me. Maybe there is something wrong with her. And so Brenda ran to her husband and she explained what happened, and he was very reassuring and said, look, honey, you should just totally ignore the voices again. There's probably nothing wrong with you. Just try to relax and have a nice vacation. But Brenda could not relax. She could not ignore the voices because they were constantly telling her,
you need to leave. You need to go back. There's something wrong with you.
And so finally, Brenda convinced her family to end the vacation early, and they headed back to London. And as soon as they got there, Brenda made her husband come with her, and they drove to the street address the voices had given her. And when they got to this very specific location, they found themselves standing in front of the brain scan unit of a London hospital. Brenda and her husband were totally shocked, but before they could even react to what they were looking at, the voices in Brenda's head came back, and they told her,
you need to go inside and you need to request a brain scan for 2 reasons. 1, there's a tumor in your brain. And 2, this tumor is causing your brainstem to swell.
At this point, Brenda was so scared that this information might actually be true that despite what her husband was saying, she went right inside the brain scan unit and she requested the scan. And when they asked her, who's the doctor that referred you over here? She said, I don't have one. And then she ultimately told them that, well, there are voices in my head that told me to come over here and get this scan. Now, the doctors at the brain scan facility were not totally like, get out of here, but instead they said, look, this is a very expensive scan. We can't just let you in here and get a scan because the voices told you to. We need a clinical reason to do it. We need a doctor's note saying you need this scan. And so they turned Brenda away, and Brenda now is just a complete wreck. She ends up calling her psychiatrist and she explains the situation about getting this address and being told to get this brain scan. And after a few minutes of hearing her story, her psychiatrist says, okay, you know what? I will call over and I will get you an appointment to get a brain scan because I want you to be at ease. And it seems like this is probably the only way we're going to be able to do that. And so after this conversation, the psychiatrist got in touch with this hospital and he requested the brain scan for Brenda. And about a month later, Brenda went in, she had the scan done, and sure enough, she had a brain tumor and her brainstem was swollen. The doctors couldn't believe it because Brenda was showing absolutely no signs of having this condition. And so they told her that, well, you can just wait and see what happens. This might not have any effect on you. And so you can just wait to see if you get symptoms eventually, or we can go in and do the surgery and remove this tumor. But of course, doing brain surgery comes with some very significant risks. After thinking it over with her family, Brenda decided to go with immediate surgery. And after telling her doctors as much, the voices in her head told her that she had made the right decision. A couple of days later, Brenda went in and her surgery was a huge success. After she regained consciousness in the recovery room, the voices spoke to her. They said,
we are pleased to have helped you. Goodbye.
After that, Brenda never heard the voices ever again, and she never had any complications from the surgery or from the tumor. And to this day, the medical community still has no idea who who those voices in her head really were. Michael Packard might be the luckiest or unluckiest person alive. In 2001, when Michael was 38 years old, he was on a flight over Costa Rica when the small plane he was on crashed. The pilot, co-pilot, and a passenger were all killed on impact, but Michael and the 4 other passengers, they survived the crash, but they were all left badly injured and stranded in a very remote section of the jungle. The survivors attempted to use the downed plane's radio equipment to send out a distress signal to try to get someone to come out and help them, but they had no way of knowing if anybody was receiving their signal. And so all they could do was just send it out and then wait and hope somebody found them before they all died. And sure enough, 48 hours after crashing, rescuers were able to hack their way deep into the jungle where Michael and the other survivors were, and they were all saved. While Michael was recovering in the hospital, a doctor told him that based on his injuries, he would not have survived another night out in that jungle. The chances of even being in a plane crash are astronomically low. The odds are about 1 in 5 million, with some places giving odds as low as 1 in 20 million. To put that in perspective, Michael was far more likely to have been struck by lightning, which is about a 1 in 1 million chance, than he was to have been in that plane crash. But that plane crash would not be the last time that Michael defied the odds and did something totally unbelievable. Over the next couple of decades, Michael, who was a commercial diver by trade, would survive not 1, but 2 significant encounters with great white sharks off the coast of California. Some of Michael's friends would not be so lucky. Michael would get lost at sea, like really lost, like treading out in the middle of the ocean with no land in sight for hours lost. But miraculously, a boat would find him and save him again. And Michael would discover the body of a long-time missing person hidden underneath the water about 60 feet down off the coast of Massachusetts. But of all the improbable exploits of Michael's life, none is more unbelievable than what happened to him in 2021, which experts are saying he had about a 1 in 1 trillion chance of experiencing. On the morning of June 11th, 2021, Michael, who was 57 years old at the time, hopped in a boat with his longtime diving partner, Josiah. Once they were all situated and they had all their equipment inside of the boat, they took off and headed for the open waters right off the coast of Cape Cod, Massachusetts, where they planned to do some lobster diving. A popular way to retrieve lobsters is to literally just dive down and by hand pick them up and bring them back to the surface. And so that day, that's what Michael and Josiah planned to do. Once they reached this spot right off the coast, Michael put on all of his scuba diving equipment and hopped in the water. Josiah did not put on any diving equipment because he was not going to be getting in the water for this dive. Instead, he would remain on the boat and help Michael get in and out of the water. He'd pull lobsters up onto the boat, and he was also there in case of an emergency, he could call for help. And so just after 6 a.m., once Michael was in the water and signaled he was good to go, he dove down below, and after a little while, he came back up, but with a relatively small haul of lobsters. And so the two men figured that, well, I guess today's just not a great day for catching lobsters. But regardless, for the next couple of hours, Michael continued to go down and catch as many lobsters as he possibly could. By 8 a.m., Michael had captured approximately 100 pounds of lobsters that were now in the boat. And so Michael and Josiah were actually starting to feel pretty good about this particular trip. And so Michael decided he would go back down one more time and try to get just a few more lobsters before they called it a day. And so Josiah remembers watching Michael, who was in the water, as he put his mouthpiece back in. He signaled up to Josiah that he was good to go, and Josiah watched as he disappeared below the surface. The water was very calm, and Josiah is just kind of scanning out across the water, and then all of a sudden this eruption of white water came rushing up to the surface right where Michael had gone down below. And so right away Josiah leaned out over the edge of the boat to see if he could look down and see his friend, but he didn't see Michael anywhere. Instead, he saw something massive moving around underneath them. After Michael had broken the surface on this final dive down to get more lobsters, his plan was to sink down to the bottom of the ocean at about 60 feet and then go hunting for lobsters. But when he had descended to about 45 feet, he felt something smash into him from behind that felt like a truck hitting him, and then everything around him went totally pitch black. The impact of whatever it was that hit him had caused his mouthpiece to get blown out of his mouth. So he doesn't have air and he starts fumbling around to find his mouthpiece, but he can't find it. And as he's fumbling around, his hands are making contact with what feels like walls all around him. He was inside of an enclosed space. But when he had touched these walls, they were not normal walls. They were soft, but they were hard at the same time, and they seemed to be moving, like they were pulsating or quivering. The space he was in was fairly large, and it was not completely flooded with water. It was like Michael had slipped into this air pocket. But this air pocket was not stationary. It was moving, and pretty fast, because the water that was inside of it was violently sloshing all around. Michael could hear it slapping up against the walls. As Michael continued to panic and fumble around for his mouthpiece, he started to notice intense pressure on his legs, but he had no idea what was causing it, and because it's pitch black, he couldn't see what it was. Finally, Michael found the line that was connected to his mouthpiece. He jammed it in his mouth and he took a long inhale, and now that he could breathe again, he had this horrifying thought. Have I been swallowed by a shark? He instinctively began feeling around for the shark's teeth, but there were no teeth inside of this space. Instead, it was just these walls that continued to shift and move all around him. And that's when it dawned on him. He had been swallowed, but not by a shark. He had been swallowed by a whale. For nearly 45 seconds, Michael was trapped inside the closed mouth of a humpback whale. Despite their enormous size, they can be up to 60 feet long and weigh up to 70,000 pounds, they only eat small fish. So when this particular whale realized Michael was not a tiny fish, it began violently swinging its head side to side to try to dislodge Michael, and that caused that eruption of white water to go to the surface that Josiah saw. And after a few good shakes, Michael was spat out of this whale's mouth. Michael remembers suddenly being in the open water with enough light coming down that he could see around him. The water was very turbulent and churning, and he recalled as he made his way to the surface, looking straight down and seeing the tail fin of this enormous whale swimming away from him. Michael made his way to the surface and he flagged down Josiah, who boated over to him. He pulled him back into the boat, and Michael, who was totally traumatized by what happened, could only say to Josiah that he was inside of it and that it tried to eat him. After Josiah brought Michael back to shore and called the authorities, Michael was rushed to a hospital where he was evaluated, and unbelievably, he suffered really no injuries. He had some significant bruising to his legs where the whale had actually clamped down on him. That was the pressure he felt in his legs. The mouth of the whale was closing on his legs. But besides that, there really wasn't any other injuries. And so later that day, he was discharged. It's believed the whale was a juvenile that had been seen in the area that was about 30 to 35 feet long, and that had just accidentally scooped Michael up. The whale was certainly not trying to hurt Michael. Whales, especially humpback whales, are not in the business of hurting people. But in this exchange with Michael, Michael could have very easily died. He could have drowned or suffocated inside the mouth of this whale, or he could have just died from blunt force trauma. But luckily he didn't. Despite how terrifying this incident sounds, Michael was incredibly casual in all of his interviews about this. He just kind of acted like, yeah, these things kind of happen, whales come out of nowhere, they just scoop you up, it happens. And he would tell the incredulous reporters who just could not believe this guy was real that as soon as he was better, he was getting back in the water and going lobster diving. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comment section what it is and where you found it. So give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comment section. If you got something out of today's video and you haven't done this already, please ask the like button if you can have a bite of their sandwich. When they say yes, proceed to take the biggest bite you possibly can. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3 or 4 video uploads. If you're interested in buying MrBallen merchandise, like this flannel, like this hat, you can go to our shop by going to our Instagram page called Shop MrBallen. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is MrBallen. I also have a second YouTube channel called MrBallen Shorts where I post random short videos and lost episodes. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya.